Hello and welcome to this quick bite for Year 7 Shifting Contexts. So this quick bite session is for anyone who hasn't taught Year 7 before or is new to teaching Year 7 within an academy, or if you're a non-specialist and you're picking up Year 7, it's a useful one to have a look at in terms of how do we incorporate non-fiction text into essentially a fiction scheme, what the expectation is about how that text is used, and really, I think more than anything, the rationale underpinning that. So if we just go back to the curriculum overview, there's a section there that deals directly with hub text, and there's an explanation as to what those are and why we use them within the scheme and what that means in terms of our conceptual threading throughout the year and within the scheme as well. So core texts or topics are used as hubs and they're linked to genres and time periods. But within that, they'll each harbour their own concepts that students will deepen in terms of their knowledge over the course of the year, but equally within the actual scheme itself. So if we take, for instance, A Midsummer Night's Dream, there are non-fiction texts that supplement the student's understanding of a concept that they're looking at in the scheme. So it could be that they're looking at relationships and they're looking at marriage, and there'll be non-fiction hub text that helps kind of develop that even further. And that hub text could be something that's quite contrasting to what they're looking at in terms of presentation in A Midsummer Night's Dream, or it may be quite similar. So it could be used to help develop and broaden their understanding of the concept, but it can also be used as a way of perhaps consolidating that as well. So it's a lot like that image that's on the slide there, where you've got lots of pins and lots of bits of thread. And if you think about the hub text being those pins, that you'll see them dotted around the scheme and dotted around future schemes that they'll encounter during their course of Year 7. And within them, we've got lots of bits of string. And those bits of string are the key concepts. And they're kind of like pinned together and developed to such a point that there are some concepts that are stronger than others. And you can see that by the darkening of the threads. And that means that the student, by the end of their study of that concept, they'll develop a really deep understanding of it, which goes beyond just simply defining what the concept is, but actually exploring it in a more nuanced way. So in the amuse-bouche for this scheme, we've gone through the phase content for Shakespearean drama in English, and Year 7, sorry. But what's interesting about it is that there are key threshold concepts already identified in it. And you can see, if you just look at the context section of that box, students within the scheme are expected to consider concepts such as attitudes towards marriage, religion, gender, the imbalances within that. So as students are approaching that, they'll then have an opportunity to look at their hub texts as a way of developing some of the concept further. So if you look across the scheme overview, you can see that in week 3, for instance, they look at how the relationship between Demetrius and Helena is problematic. They then think about the place of religion and superstition. And then you can see that in lesson 4 of that week, they begin to think about another way of looking at arranged marriage. So arranged marriage or forced marriage is a concept that they've looked at within the Midsummer Night's Dream. In week 2, they've also looked at a non-fiction text that talks about arranged marriage or unarranged marriage. And now they're looking at another perspective. And again, it's a way of demonstrating to the students there is more than one way that we can view this concept, but equally these concepts that Shakespeare's discussing at his time are universal to our own social context now. So unlike the amuse-bouche, I'm not going to run through the sequence of learning for this scheme, but I am going to cherry pick where students are developing their contextual understanding and how that in turn supports their understanding of the concept. So here they've got a piece of academic research. It is quite challenging and difficult, and there's an element of scaffolding needed around it. But the main focus really is to give students a little bit of a starting point really in their understanding of what 16th century marriages would have looked like. So they understand a bit better the dynamic between Hermia and her father, and equally the expectations surrounding women of the time. So they're then given a series of questions, and perhaps this is the most important part of the activity because it's here where students have better understanding of what that relationship would look like at that particular time. But equally begin to think about their expectations for marriage. So you've got questions like, what do men compare the control over the wife and children to? If a woman couldn't have children, how was this viewed? Then they've got the question, what did a woman not have a right to own? So those things get them to understand how that may differ from today's society, but help them to understand why marriage is presented in that way within the play. Essentially, what students have been looking at is the concept of control, and they've looked at how characters in the play demonstrate control, but equally how control or power was presented at that time and how Shakespeare's responding to that. So, when they produce their piece of writing in this Peel structure, they're implicitly talking about that. So, you can see that control is used within the point, they're given the quotation, they then look at language features that help them to discuss that particular concept in a bit more detail, so the pronoun mine, and then they link back to that context. So Shakespeare's time that fathers were able to rule over their children. So that's their first exposure to it. Then they'll move on to their hub text. So this hub text, focusing upon the unarranged marriage, enables students to think about how the idea of control is presented across two different time frames, but equally looking at a slightly different genre as well. So if you have a look at this bit here, they're given a really clear definition in the pink box about the difference between arranged marriage and forced marriage. And then immediately within the yellow task box, they're asked, well, how would you describe Hermia's situation? Were Hermia to agree to marry Demetrius based on their father's threats, would that change how we viewed it? So in that particular regard, students now are beginning to define that piece of context within what they've read so far in the text itself. So in their reading of the unarranged marriage, students would have encountered Manny's feelings of disconnection from his family and not quite understanding the tradition around arranged marriages and how that was applicable to him. It's enabling our students to think about, again, that difference between arranged marriage as opposed to forced marriage, but equally to try and pinpoint where there are similarities between Hermia and Manny. Do they feel as though the situations are quite similar? How are they different? And why might they be different? And that could be a discussion about gender, about the place of choice. But you've given an example at the bottom there that helps students to kind of structure that. And this could be done as part of an RSE activity as well as something that is a bit more formalised and more focused upon their writing skills in a compare and contrast. And there are some sentence starters within the activity for you to use. But the main thing here is how quickly they move from looking at a non-fiction piece of writing to the genre of the play that they're looking at currently in the formal lessons that they've just done for that week, and their ability to sort of try and establish connections between them so that they appreciate that actually the concept of marriage and control is far more nuanced, that there are degrees of control, and how across different contexts that's mitigated, I suppose. In week 3, students return back to this idea of the differences between forced marriage and arranged marriage, but now their understanding's deepened, the requirement for their answers have become a bit more complex. So as before they had to think about what the two definitions meant in relation to Hermia and her situation, they now need to think, well, what are some of the positives in arranged marriage and what are some of the negatives? And equally, what are the negatives of a forced marriage? So can you see that that development has come about through their progression of learning, their exposure to different texts that talk about the concept of marriage? And here they're beginning to think about the idea of shame and how that's attached to it. And they're going to use another piece of non-fiction to help them to develop that further. So all throughout the week, students have been focusing upon marriage and relationships and the presentation of female characters within the play Midsummer Night's Dream. And they've been developing a more nuanced understanding of that concept by looking at hub texts, such as these non-fiction texts, and we've just seen one previously. But you can see in the question in the yellow tasks box where students now are beginning to think about control and shame through the prism of this text. So you can see words like confused and trapped and the idea of acceptance. So when students are approaching the text, especially those parts that are highlighted in red, they should be looking for evidence that would exemplify that particular concept. That's the end for this quick bite for Year 7 shifting contexts. I think the main takeaway is that the hub texts within the schemes, and not necessarily just within this one scheme but across future schemes in Year 7, is that they are used to help either broaden their understanding of a concept or actually allow them to think about the concept in a more nuanced way by demonstrating differences. And actually, conceptual understanding and context are really sort of dovetailed, they work hand in hand. And so their understanding about how that concept shifts over time can be just as fruitful as looking at the concept itself in one particular text.